The so-called law of gravity is a monumental hoax and constitutes one of the biggest psyops in all of history. Assuming we actually live on the spinning globe Earth promoted by modern Freemasonic science, consider the following calculations and contradictions. The supposed law of gravity claims its mysterious action at a distance force can be measured as g times m1 times m2 over r squared, with g being equivalent to 6.674 times 10 to the power of minus 11. Now, consider the One World Trade Center in New York, which has a mass of approximately 1,050,000,000 kilograms. This means that if you are an 80-kilogram man standing 10 meters away from the One World Trade Center, then there should be an expected horizontal gravity of 0.05606 meters per second squared. Considering the standard rate of vertical gravity is 9.81 meters per second squared, this means the expected horizontal gravity from the One World Trade Center should be pulling at about 1/174th that of standard vertical gravity. This may not sound significant, but it must be measurable, and this point becomes extremely interesting when the same 80-kilogram man stands just 1 meter from the One World Trade Center. In this instance, the questionable law of gravity calculates that the horizontal gravity increases 100-fold to a whopping 5.606 meters per second squared, which is more than half of standard vertical gravity. This would absolutely be both measurable and noticeable. The gravitational attraction between an 80-kilogram man standing 1 meter from the World Trade Center should be easily felt and should require significant effort to resist being pulled into the wall like a magnet. Finally, if the same man were to be so unfortunate as to touch the Trade Center, the bogus law of gravity says that you will need to call the fire brigade to come and detach the man, because he will no longer be able to break free by his own strength. Consider the same 80-kilogram man now on a vacation to Switzerland, where he goes to rock climb the famous north face of the Eiger Mountain. Here, the mystical law of gravity predicts that even if he loses his grip while climbing, there is no need to fear, because it's impossible for him to fall from the 10-billion-ton mountain. Since the distance between himself and the mountain is almost zero, making r squared in the equation nearly negligible, the amount of horizontal gravity pulling at him should cause him to cling to the rock face like a magnet sticking to a refrigerator door. Thus, according to the magical law of gravity, we are assured that rock climbing massive mountains like these is actually among the safest of pursuits imaginable, because falling is deemed physically impossible. Again, it cannot be overstated. The formula for gravity implicitly implies that as any two objects approach each other, the closer the r value drops to zero, the stronger the pulling force that exists between them. When two objects physically touch each other, the gravitational force between them increases to a very large number, implying that they should become difficult to separate. In reality, however, only magnets behave this way, and no other objects show this supposed increased attraction proportional to distance, as predicted by gravity. Freemasonic science apologists, attempting to refute the necessity of non-vertical gravity, will often assert the Star Trek argument of, "Gravity only comes from the center of the Earth, Captain." But this is a nonsensical double standard, because the same broken law of gravity claims this calculable mutual attraction exists between all objects, even between two particles, and not solely from the center. Google AI clarifies, quote, "Gravitational attraction emanates from the entire mass of an object, not just from its center of mass. When dealing with objects far apart, or those with spherical symmetry, assuming all mass concentrates at a single point is done to simplify calculations. Gravity acts on all parts. While the center of mass is helpful for simplified calculations, every part of an object contributes to its gravitational field, and this distributed attraction has significant consequences in various situations. In other words, the pull of gravity comes from the entire mass of objects, not just from their center. So the excuse of claiming gravity only comes from the center of the Earth globe is an unevidenced, backpedaling double standard. Another one of gravity's nonsensical double standards is that this same force is attributed to two very different effects. Gravity is said to cause all objects, people, buildings, oceans, and the entire atmosphere to stay clinging stuck to the spinning globe Earth. Meanwhile, gravity is also said to cause the moon to orbit around the Earth and other planets to orbit around the sun, and the solar system to orbit around the galaxy. This means that sometimes gravity causes objects to stick to one another, and other times gravity causes objects to orbit around one another. How can these two very different effects be attributed to the same force? Freemasonic science claims that if the initial speed and trajectory of the two objects is just right, then instead of crashing together, they can somehow perpetually orbit each other, due to the force of gravity being perfectly balanced out by the object's inertia, causing a continuous curve around the central object. If this is true, why is there not a single experiment or demonstration in history that shows two objects meeting with such perfect inertia and trajectory as to lock themselves in perpetual orbit with one another? Why is this special effect of gravity conveniently limited only to objects so large we cannot experiment on them? Yet another contradiction and double standard from the illogical law of gravity is the behavior of helium balloons. The formula for calculating the force of gravity depends solely on the masses of the two objects and the distance between them. This means any objects of non-zero mass will be subject to the pull of gravity proportional to their distance from one another. Why then do helium balloons defy this fickle law of gravity by first rising and then clinging to your ceiling for several days before slowly starting to hover lower, and then after many more hours or days eventually settle to the ground? Releasing the helium balloon from 10 meters off the ground or 1 centimeter off the ground makes absolutely no difference to the balloon's immediate defiance of gravity. The same applies for a basketball thrown into a lake. The broken law of gravity calculates that the basketball must sink and remain stuck at the bottom of the lake because the force of gravity depends solely on the masses of the two objects and the distance between them. But the basketball defies this law by immediately rising to the surface right after it's thrown in. How is it that helium balloons and basketballs can become veritable anti-gravity devices? It's because the effects of so-called gravity were actually well understood and adequately explained by Archimedes over 2,000 years ago. The Archimedes principle, buoyant force, and relative density already explained the effects of fake gravity better and long before Freemason and Jesuit Isaac Newton came along with his inferior and redundant theory. Under the valid laws of density and buoyancy, everything seeks its relative density with the medium surrounding, and rises or falls accordingly. The true constant is density, not gravity. Basketballs fall down because they are denser than air, and helium balloons rise up because they are lighter than air. A basketball held underwater and released quickly rises to the surface because the air inside the basketball causes it to have a density less than water. Then, if a hole is poked in the basketball and all the air squeezed out, it will once again sink to the bottom of the lake because its relative density has increased to being more than water. Newton's redundant theory of gravity has nothing to do with this and simply piggybacks off Archimedes' principle and the natural physics of density and buoyancy. If Newton's apple had landed in a puddle instead of on his head, he would have seen the apple only fell through the air because it was denser than the air, but then floated on top of the water because it was less dense than water. These so-called effects of gravity have everything to do with relative density and buoyant force, and nothing to do with Newton's extraneous theory of magical action at a distance. In reality, this pulling force called gravity has never been proven to exist, and the only reason it is referred to as law is because the majority of Freemasonic science depends upon it. Without this myth of gravity, a whole host of other lies and misconceptions are exposed as nothing but untenable theories, including the supposed spinning globe you're told you live on.